Thank you for joining Jennifer Schaus and Associates in our 2019 Webinar Wednesday series. We are coming to you live from downtown Washington, D.C. Our webinars are every Wednesday, and you can find the upcoming schedule on our website. Past webinars and all recordings are also on our website and on our YouTube channel, along with over 160 other recordings on federal contracting topics. All are complimentary. If you have questions for our speaker today, you can email her directly with the contact information you'll see on the last slide. All right, just a little bit about us. We are a Washington, D.C. based firm and provide services for federal contractors. This ranges from market analysis reports to proposal writing and also post-award compliance. More information is on our website, so please visit us. These are a few upcoming events that you can find more information here or also on our website. And we now offer advertising, and you can email me if you wanted more information. And our webinar today is sponsored by AccuTrack. There's a short message from them.
AccuTrack Consulting and Accounting Services is an 8A WOSB CPA firm committed to supporting entities sustain growth in government contracting. Our outstanding DCAA accounting solutions reduce audit risk, improve cash flows, and give you peace of mind. Contact us today to learn how we can enhance your DCAA accounting efforts.
All right, let's go ahead and get started. Our speaker today is Gina Mushriki, and we're going to be covering how and when the government set aside contracts. And I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thank you, Mallory. If you can move to the next slide, please. Just before we start, I'll introduce myself. I'm the founding principal of Corporate Law Solutions. We are a small business firm with offices in Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia, and advise both small and medium-sized businesses as well as government agencies on government procurement matters. And so this is why today's topic is, one that's near and dear to my heart, because I think set-aside contracts are just great. Next slide, please. So we will discuss how and when the government sets aside contracts. And we'll be talking about 3 main things just so that we're all on the same page. First, we'll talk about what it means to set aside contracts. Then we'll talk about why the government sets aside contracts. And then lastly, we'll talk about how the government sets aside contracts. Next slide, please. So what does it mean to set aside contracts? Basically, as most of you probably know, government procurement, because it involves public funds, requires sort of open competition so that the government is essentially, one, getting the best deal, so to speak, on any goods or services that it procures, but two, so that sort of the open market has an opportunity, everyone in the open market has an opportunity to participate. So when the government sets aside contracts, it's essentially putting away a certain portion of contracting dollars for a particular type or size of company. And so the government is legally restricting competition and making certain contracts and certain procurements not available to the open market. And making eligibility to even bid, propose, or compete on those type of procurements available only for a specific category or size of contractors. Next slide, please. So, why does the government do this? There's a general policy that small business is good for the economy. It promotes growth. And so, there's by statute, the federal government is required to set aside 23% of all federal contracting dollars to small businesses. And so that's the policy and that's the statutory goal. But also on a more micro level for contracting officers and for agencies, set-aside contracts often come with simplified acquisition procedures, which means that the government agency and its representatives don't have to go through as much paperwork, essentially, to procure those type of services. And, you know, that's just the general rule. We'll talk more in detail about when that happens and what it means. Next slide, please. So, how does the government do this? How does the government set aside contracts? We talked about meeting the goal of the overall goal of 23% of all federal contracting dollars that needs to go to small businesses. So this is sort of meeting this goal is divided into two ways of getting there. One is based on, hey, these companies are small businesses, so we're setting aside these procurements for small businesses, and the SBA works with each federal agency to kind of cumulatively come to that 23% goal. And then there are statutory and regulatory sort of confines that are based on the value of procurement that, quote unquote, automatically go to small businesses. Next slide, please. So in the first prong, we talked about category of the contractor, so the overall small business goal of 23%. That is further divided into smaller goals of small businesses that are not just based on size standard, but are also based on socioeconomic status. So 5% of federal contracting goals are, there's the goal to go to women-owned businesses, another 5% to small disadvantaged businesses, 3% of service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses, another 3% to Hubzone businesses, and then there's also 8A certified businesses that there's 8A set-asides as well. And although these percentages may seem small, just try and put this into context of the total amount of dollars that the federal government spends, and, you know, do the math from there, and you'll see the type of numbers that we're talking about. So we'll kind of start from the bottom of that list and talk about 8A set-asides for a little bit. 8A certification is quite an arduous process. Companies that are 8A certified are in the 8A program for 9 years. After that, they graduate. They must be formally certified by the SBA. Like I said, it's quite a process, but once received, if you're kind of prepared for it, it can be a good vehicle to open up a world of contracts for your firm. This comes through either sole source set-asides or competitive set-asides for 8As. Women-owned businesses are basically where the company's owned 51% or more and managed by women. Small disadvantaged business relates to the revenue and the income or the net worth of the owners, so to speak, of the business. Service disabled veterans kind of speaks for itself. Hubzones, for those of you who are unfamiliar with them, are pre-identified tracts by the government where the government is trying to promote economic growth in certain areas, and so companies are encouraged to open their main offices in these areas. And so one of the ways of encouraging that is, if you have this certification, you are eligible for certain set-aside contracts. Next slide, please. Now that we've kind of briefly touched on the different categories of small businesses, we'll talk about the other prong, which is the value of procurement. And there's two kind of upper limit and lower limit to kind of think of. The micro purchase acquisition threshold and the simplified acquisition threshold. And those numbers have been changing through the years, as you can probably guess, due to inflation and the amounts of federal dollars being spent. But these are currently, the micro purchase acquisition threshold has been recently upped to $10,000, and the simplified acquisition threshold has been up to $250,000, which essentially means that any procurement by a federal agency that's between $10,000 and $250,000 is automatically set aside for small businesses, and the contracting officers or contracting agency can use simplified acquisition procedures to complete this procurement. I'll briefly touch on what that means, but it essentially, means that the general rules of, like we said earlier in the webinar, of announcing or soliciting the procurement through the open market is not required. The general rules of bid and offer are not really followed. And if people have questions about simplified acquisition procedures, please feel free to reach out to me after the webinar. But it is a much less complicated procedure in terms of procurement of goods and services by the government. Next slide, please. So you have your rule that if the procurement is between $10,000 and $250,000, it's automatically set aside to a small business, and that's obviously a general rule. And there are exceptions. For example, if there's no reasonable expectation that a small business can perform this contract, then the contracting officer is not bound to go to a small business. But the default is to go to a small business. If the procurement is above that, that's what we'll talk about next. So if the procurement value is above the simplified acquisition threshold, which is currently at $250,000, a couple of rules come into play, generally speaking. The most popular one is the rule of two, which means that even if the procurement is above $250,000, there is a preference to go to small businesses if the contracting agency can obtain offers from at least two responsible small businesses. And the other part of that rule is that the award, when it is eventually made, can be made at a fair market price. So essentially, the government needs to, through its processes of obtaining an independent government estimate, needs to know that there are small businesses that can perform this or provide these services or provide these goods, and that they are responsible, and that the award the contracting agency will be making will be at a fair market price in accordance with an independent government estimate. Next slide, please. The other piece of the rules that kind of come into play when the government makes a purchase from small businesses that's above the simplified acquisition threshold is a rule called the limitations on subcontracting. And this has been a very popular topic lately. In fact, I just published an article in the NCMA magazine because there have been a lot of changes in the limitations on subcontracting that the SBA has put into effect that federal agencies have kind of not caught up with. So again, an important rule to be aware of and to look at if you are a small business that is subcontracting with a large business or vice versa. But mainly if the prime contractor getting the award is a small business, the prime contractor cannot subcontract more than a certain percentage of the contract dollars. And again, these rules are put into place to make sure that the small business that got the award is actually the business that is getting the benefit of the award, so to speak, and that these set-asides or that these goals that are being met are truly benefiting small businesses to kind of comply with the policy of the statute and the regulations. So what are those percentages? For contracts of service and supply contracts, that percentage is 50%. For general construction contracts, that percentage is 85%. And for specialty trade construction contracts, that percentage is 75%. So if you are a small business prime contractor, you cannot subcontract more than 50% of the value of your awarded contract to a large business. So think of that in terms of your subcontracting agreements, think of that in terms of your teaming agreements, and potentially joint venture agreements as well. One exception to that general percentage rule is what is called the similarly situated entities exception. Similarly situated entities are basically businesses that are either the same size for that particular NAICS code or the same socioeconomic status, depending on what type of set-aside contract this is. So if I'm a woman-owned business and I meet the small business size standard for a particular NAICS code for a set-aside contract, and I am awarded this contract as the prime, and I decide to subcontract a portion of the work, I can subcontract 70% of it to another woman-owned small business that meets the small business size standards, or I can subcontract technically 90% even, but I can't do the same thing with a large business or a business that's not a woman-owned small business if it's a woman-owned set-aside procurement. Again, that's just the general rule. There's plenty of exceptions on how that's calculated. Feel free to, if you're an NCMA member, feel free to pick up the article in the April issue. If not, feel free to shoot me an email or get in touch with me, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have on that. Next slide, please. The final rule is, well, not final, but sort of the third major rule when it comes to government set-aside contracts for small businesses and the limitations on that is the non-manufacturer rule. And this applies to procurement of goods. And basically the general rule is that the prime contractor must manufacture government procured items with its own facilities. So if you're a small business prime that got an award for the provision of services, generally the rule is you must manufacture those goods with your own facilities. The exception to that rule is if you're considered a non-manufacturer. And to be considered a non-manufacturer, you basically have to meet several criteria, the majority of which are size-related and industry-related. Again, complicated set of rules, so I won't take up your time on this webinar to go through them, but you know, feel free to reach out to me or to look up the non-manufacturer rule when you have some time. But also, if you're a small business seeking or pursuing a contract for goods, just something to be aware of, and to be aware of whether you would be eligible for an exception or an exemption, or if not, the SBA, you know, can obtain a waiver if there's no such manufacturer that exists. Also important to remember that this also comes into play with in software purchases. So when I say goods, it's not just widgets as we speak in law school hypotheticals, but also sort of software bundled solutions. So with that, I'll kind of wrap this up. Just important to remember, government set-aside contracts depend on size and socioeconomic status in terms of small businesses, and also depend on the value of procurement. If the procurement is above $250,000 currently, the contracting agency can still set aside the procurement to small businesses as long as there's at least 2 responsible small businesses that can do the work, and that the award can be made at a fair market price. And the 3 major kind of limitations to think of when it comes to that include, you know, how much of that work can be subcontracted, and the manufacturing and non-manufacturer rule exception. And with that, I will conclude and turn it over to you, Mallory.
Thank you for sharing your knowledge and insight today. Today's presentation has been recorded and can be found on our website or YouTube channel within about 48 hours. If you have questions about today's topic, you can contact her at the phone number or email shown on your screen. Thank you, everybody. This concludes the webinar.